Hello. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the first 20 months or so of the Second World War. It's a period between two hugely significant actions by the German army: the invasion of Poland on the 1st of September 1939 and the epic invasion of the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941. When I was taught this history more than 50 years ago, my teacher said that the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 marked the beginning of a racial war, whereas the invasion of Poland had to be understood as a more conventional war. But an enormous amount of academic research since then has demonstrated how important it is that we understand that from the very first moment the German army set foot in Poland, this war had profound racial connotations. Thus, from the outset of the German invasion of Poland in September 1939, the war was framed by the Nazis as a racial conflict, aimed not only at military conquest, but also at the brutal subjugation of entire ethnic groups. The Nazi regime viewed Jews, Poles, and other Slavic peoples as racially dangerous, and this ideology was reflected in the brutal tactics used by the invading forces. Special killing units, like the Einsatzgruppen, were deployed to target and murder selected groups deemed undesirable by the Nazi state. These units carried out shootings, deportations, and other atrocities. A few German officers, notably General Johannes Blaskowitz, protested against these actions, particularly the mass executions of civilians, although their objections had little impact on this racial war. Blaskowitz, who served as a commander in Poland, was deeply disturbed by the brutal treatment of the Polish population, but his protests were ignored by higher command, and he was eventually sidelined. The racial war against the Poles and Jews continued unabated, and would only escalate dramatically in the years that followed. Consequently, Poland suffered hugely in this conflict. By the end of the Second World War, about 6 million Poles had died, around half of that number Jews. As well as remembering that this was from the beginning a racial war, it's also important to realize that the Nazis didn't conquer all of Poland in the autumn of 1939. They conquered only half of it. The country was initially divided between Germany and the Soviet Union following the secret agreement between Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed at the end of August 1939. And so it was that on the 17th of September 1939, Stalin's Red Army invaded the eastern part of Poland, thereby splitting the country in two. This division was not just military. The Nazis and the Soviets cooperated closely on a range of practical issues, including population transfers, border demarcations, and the brutal repression of civilians in the occupied territories. This collaboration between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was ironic, given the ideological conflict between the two regimes. Hitler and the Nazis, for instance, were fanatical anti-communists. Hitler believed, as he wrote in 1924, that the rulers of present-day Russia are common blood-stained criminals who represented the scum of humanity. Scaling the heights of hyperbole, he claimed they were responsible for the most cruel and tyrannical regime of all time. Yet now, the Nazis found themselves working in tandem with this hated communist regime in order to achieve their shared goals of territorial expansion and ethnic cleansing. However, we've now reached the point in this history where we need to confront an even greater irony about the war. As most of you will know, Germany invaded Western Europe, France and the Low Countries, in spring 1940 and won a swift victory. Whereas the following year, they invaded the Soviet Union and became bogged down in the vastness of the Soviet steppes. So after the war, the 1940 campaign came to be seen as a brilliant military success, while the war against Stalin was viewed as a reckless, overambitious folly. But here's what's important to understand. In reality, many of the German generals who were involved in the planning of these operations were far more concerned about the Western campaign, which they thought was hugely risky and being launched before the German armed forces were ready. To these German commanders, it was the war against the French in the West that was the mad campaign. This invasion seemed doomed to them from the start, given the complexities of fighting against the well-armed and well-prepared French and British forces. Conversely, the invasion of the Soviet Union was viewed by many German generals as a much easier task. It's one of the most important examples in history of how knowing the outcome of an event can cloud our understanding of what people actually felt at the time. So why was it, you might ask, that German generals were so concerned about invading Western Europe, and yet the attack went on to succeed so well? Well, in essence, it was because if the initial battle plan had been followed in the autumn of 1939, the generals would have been proven right, and Germany would almost certainly have lost. That attack was planned as a near replica of the failed invasion of 1914. Luckily for the Germans, bad weather kept delaying the invasion date. But by early 1940, German intelligence believed that the Allies had uncovered their invasion plans, something which helped make them reconsider their strategy. A more radical and innovative approach now emerged, the Manstein plan, named after General Erich von Manstein. The plan's most audacious element was the idea of launching a rapid invasion through the Ardennes Forest, a region previously considered utterly unsuitable for mechanized forces. An attack via this southern flank, bypassing heavily fortified defences, was a bold and risky move. But it worked, and the success of this strategy would lead to the rapid encirclement of French and British forces. However, it's almost impossible to exaggerate how big a gamble this was. If the German forces had been delayed or blocked in the Ardennes, the entire offensive could have failed, and Germany would have lost the war. Yet Hitler, a gambler at heart, approved the idea, and the result was a stunning victory. Ultimately, it was a combination of German audacity and Allied complacency that led to the fall of France. Almost incredibly, the entire campaign, from the initial attack to France's surrender, lasted only about 6 weeks. The victory over France in 1940 was a decisive moment for Hitler, elevating his prestige to new heights. Many in Germany now saw him as a brilliant strategist, with one of his generals even calling him the greatest warlord of all time. But even though the Germans had won an extraordinary victory, they faced a problem. Britain had not given up. Over 300,000 troops had been rescued from the beaches at Dunkirk and transported to Britain, and the English Channel remained a formidable obstacle for any German invasion. As I'm sure you know, by now Winston Churchill was the British Prime Minister. He'd been appointed on the 10th of May 1940, the very same day that German forces launched their invasion of France. Britain now faced an existential challenge: whether to negotiate with Hitler and seek a peace settlement or to continue the fight. Some, including within Churchill's own government, believed that a negotiated peace might be the best outcome. But Churchill remained resolute and refused to sign any agreement with the Nazis. At the same time, the Germans prepared for an invasion of Britain. But it's questionable if this was ever a practical military plan. The Germans lacked landing craft and the experience necessary to launch what would have been the biggest amphibious invasion in modern history. Just think in comparison how long it took the Allies, with all of the resources at their disposal, to prepare for D-Day in 1944. So the idea the Germans could have organised something similar in a matter of weeks over the summer and early autumn of 1940 seems rather fanciful. Instead, it's more probable that Hitler's objective was to pressure Britain into negotiations rather than to launch a full-scale invasion. However, this is not to downplay the significance of the Battle of Britain. The bravery and resolve of those Royal Air Force pilots during the summer months is undeniable. But it's important in this context to understand that Hitler's discussions with his generals about the invasion of the Soviet Union, his great ideological enemy, actually began as early as the summer of 1940, soon after the fall of France. While Britain remained defiant, Hitler began to turn his attention eastward, driven by his long-standing convictions and his desire for Lebensraum, living space, for the German people. Unlike the comparatively small island of Britain, the Soviet Union represented a vast land of resources that could be conquered and exploited. For Hitler, the creation of an empire in the Soviet Union was always his overarching territorial goal. And this war was to escalate the racist element in the conflict to a new level. Hitler announced to his military commanders that the war against the Soviet Union was to be a war of extermination, and ordered that the political leaders of the Red Army, the commissars, together with the communist intelligentsia, should be killed rather than taken prisoner. It was vital, he said, to remember that a communist is no comrade before or after the battle, and that German commanders must make the sacrifice of overcoming their personal scruples. Despite the radical nature of Hitler's words, there was little protest from his generals. They knew of the atrocities that had taken place and were still taking place in Poland. So that was the basis on which these new brutalities could be judged. Traditional European principles of war had long since been discarded. And if you hadn't mutinied over the actions of the security forces in Poland, why would you mutiny now? Especially since Hitler's prestige as a military leader had never been higher after the triumph in the West the previous year. But there was another reason why many of Hitler's generals didn't object to the idea of a war of extermination. A number of them shared his racial prejudice against the inhabitants of the Soviet Union. For instance, General Blumentritt of the Fourth Army said, "The history of all Russian wars shows that the Russian as a combatant is illiterate and semi-Asian and thinks and feels differently from us." This was to be a war of murderous colonization, as senior figures in the SS knew all too well. Heinrich Himmler held a conference for senior SS leaders at Wewelsburg Castle shortly before the invasion and declared that 30 million people were expected to die in the occupied Soviet Union. The Nazis, it transpired, wanted the land, but they didn't want millions of people who lived on it. Why it was no accident that the ultimate horror of the Holocaust emerged during this war in the East, I'll discuss in the next episode.